The ink had barely dried before Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto leaned back in his chair, the dim lamplight flickering against the paper that carried the words he could no longer deny. Outside his cabin, the steel bones of the battleship creaked under the weight of the Pacific night. But inside, only a heavier, more human weight pressed down on him. He had written it because the truth had finally crushed its way through every layer of strategy and pride. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping industrial giant. The sentence lingered like an accusation in the stale cabin air, and though no one else had read it, Yamamoto already knew what the world would one day believe he had seen what others refused to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The room felt too small for the thoughts inside him. He rose slowly, gripping the edge of the desk, as though the rolling of the sea beneath him required a steadying hand. In reality, it was the rolling of something far larger, history itself shifting, preparing to overturn everything he had once been certain of. Pearl Harbor had been a spectacle of fire and precision, a masterstroke in the eyes of Tokyo, a confirmation that the impossible could be achieved with enough daring. He had watched, silent, as others celebrated. The officers had toasted victory, the ministers had congratulated themselves, and the newspapers had declared Japan unstoppable. Crowds cheered in the streets of Tokyo, believing, perhaps for the first time in centuries, that they were standing on the threshold of an empire vast enough to rival the sun. But Yamamoto had seen beyond the smoke. He had looked into the distance and glimpsed a shadow much larger than the islands of Japan, larger even than the Pacific itself. He knew the truth that no celebration could hide. All they had done was strike the hornet's nest, and now the buzzing had begun. He remembered the early morning stillness of December 7th, the quiet before the storm, before engines roared and steel birds screamed across the Hawaiian skies. The radio reports had come in waves, battleships aflame, airfields ruined, the Pacific Fleet staggered and gasping. Each message had been delivered with barely contained triumph, but Yamamoto only felt an ache in the pit of his stomach. Behind every announced victory, he heard something else, the grinding ignition of factories, the opening of steel-gated plants, the first pounding of rivets. America would not die in the flames of Pearl Harbor, it would rise from them. He stepped toward the small porthole, gazing out into the endless dark. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay the United States, and deep within it the furnaces of Detroit, the shipyards of the West Coast, the vast farmlands that fed millions. He had lived there once. He had travelled its cities, listened to the roar of its machinery, walked streets that seemed to stretch into eternity. While other Japanese officers imagined Americans as soft, distracted, or clumsy, Yamamoto had known a harder truth. They were a people who argued, who shouted, who grew fat on comfort, but when cornered, they transformed. They fought like men who refused to surrender a single inch of their identity. He had seen American industry like a leviathan at rest, capable of sleeping soundly through decades of peace. But now, by Japan's own hand, it was waking. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Admiral," came a voice, hesitant. "The updated reports from the Army General Staff have arrived." "Bring them in," Yamamoto replied without turning. The officer stepped inside and placed a stack of folders on the desk. Even in the half-light, Yamamoto could see the man's hands tremble. Not out of fear of him, Yamamoto was admired, almost revered, but because the officer had been at Pearl Harbor. He had seen the burning oil slicks, the bodies floating like broken dolls, the sky stained with smoke. The victory had been real, devastating, unprecedented. But something in the aftermath had unsettled him, and Yamamoto recognized the same unease in many young officers. Once the door closed, Yamamoto opened the top folder. It contained intercepted communications, early drafts of American naval mobilization, and scattered intelligence analyses. But what struck him most were the photographs, black and white images of assembly lines expanding, steel frames rising like skeletons of future giants, factory floors lit day and night. The captions were clinical. "California shipyards expansion underway," Aircraft production projected to double by summer. New plant authorization approved. He closed the folder slowly. America was not defeated. It was mobilizing. Yamamoto exhaled a breath he had been holding since Pearl Harbor. He felt suddenly old, not in his body but in his spirit, as though the war had already stretched years ahead into a future filled with fire and loss. He sank back into his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of the paper where he had written the sentence that now felt prophetic. A sharp knock broke through the silence again, more urgent this time. "Admiral, urgent message from Tokyo," the same officer called. Yamamoto waved him in. The young man handed over a sealed envelope stamped with military insignia. "High Command requests your immediate opinion on an operational expansion," he said, almost apologetically. "They believe momentum must be maintained." Yamamoto slit the envelope open with a practiced motion. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, plans for pushing deeper across the Pacific, seizing islands before American response could fully manifest, tightening control over Southeast Asia, cutting off Allied supply lines. Bold, ambitious, suicidal. "They believe momentum must be maintained," Yamamoto repeated softly. "Yes, sir." He closed the folder and placed it aside. "At what point," he murmured, barely audibly, "does momentum become a blind charge toward a cliff?" The officer swallowed. "Sir?" Yamamoto didn't answer. He looked once more toward the porthole, where the ocean rolled endlessly, seemingly calm. He knew how deceptive calm seas could be. Storms hid beneath them, and hurricanes often began as whispers on distant water. He thought of Hawaii, not the burning wreckage of December 7th, but a memory from years earlier, when he had visited Honolulu as a diplomat. He remembered the families walking along Waikiki Beach, the dense crowds in the markets, the sailors laughing in the bars. It was not softness he had seen then. It was abundance, a kind of abundance that could become ferocious when threatened. He imagined those same sailors now, rising from the wreckage, vowing revenge. He imagined American newspapers transforming tragedy into fury. He imagined Congress voting without hesitation for total war, and he imagined factories, those endless mechanical beasts shaking the very ground with their awakening. He looked down at the message from Tokyo again. "They have no idea what they've invited," he whispered. He signed the acknowledgement page without adding comment. He knew his doubts would be unwelcome, even dangerous. High Command wanted victory. They wanted validation. They wanted to believe the war could be decided by daring raids and swift conquests. They wanted to believe Japan had seized destiny by the throat. But Yamamoto knew destiny did not yield so easily. He spent the next several hours drafting a formal response, carefully worded, cautious, urging strategic patience without directly contradicting the momentum of the war effort. He chose his phrases the way a swordsman chose his cuts, precise, subtle, meant to guide without provoking. He could not openly oppose the expansion, but he could slow it. He could insist on consolidating gains, reinforcing positions, preparing for the inevitable American counterstrike. All the while, his mind drifted back to the memory of Detroit, the city that had first shown him the meaning of industrial power. He remembered the thunder of machines, the hypnotic rhythm of assembly lines, the sheer scale of production. Cars rolled out in waves, each identical, each forged with a kind of effortless precision. It was not the machines that had impressed him most, but the organizational discipline that lay behind them, the charts, the schedules, the planners who moved thousands like pieces on a living board. He had once told a Japanese colleague that if America ever converted its automobile factories into war production, it could outproduce any nation on earth. His colleague had laughed then. No one was laughing now. By dawn, the horizon paled into a muted grey, and the first faint warmth brushed against the sea. Yamamoto stepped outside onto the deck, letting the cold air bite at his face. Sailors moved with morning discipline, scrubbing the decks, preparing for another day at sea. None of them knew the war as he did. Not yet. They knew only the early triumph, the soaring pride, the sense that Japan had finally taken its rightful place among the great powers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He wished, not for the first time, that he could share with them everything he foresaw. But what good would it do? War could not be undeclared. The dice had been thrown long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor. He walked to the railing and looked out toward the rising sun. The irony did not escape him. The symbol of Japan's empire rising over a sea that would one day swallow countless ships, aircraft, and lives. The Pacific was beautiful in the morning, but Yamamoto had learned long ago that beauty and danger often dwelled side by side. A messenger approached from behind. "Admiral, we've received word from our carrier groups near Rabaul. American reconnaissance flights have increased." "Of course they have," Yamamoto replied quietly. "The giant is stirring." The messenger hesitated. "Sir?" Yamamoto shook his head. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. It was everything. Every new report, every intercepted message, every photograph of American mobilization hammered the point deeper into his mind. Japan had won a battle, yes, perhaps even several. But the war Yamamoto feared was already slipping from their grasp, not because they lacked skill or courage, but because they had awakened an enemy with more power than they had ever truly imagined. As the sun climbed higher, casting gold across the waves, Yamamoto closed his eyes. He could almost hear it in the distance, the rhythmic pounding of hammers on metal, the roar of furnaces, the grinding of gears. Thousands of workers stepping into factories, pulling levers, tightening bolts, welding frames. Thousands more, shipping steel, drilling fuel, drafting plans. It was the heartbeat of America, steady and implacable. He returned inside, to the desk where his handwritten line still lay waiting. He picked up the paper and read it again. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping industrial giant." The words no longer felt like a confession. They felt like a prophecy. He folded the paper carefully, almost reverently, and slipped it into the inner pocket of his uniform. One day, he knew, these words would matter. One day, others would understand what he had understood from the beginning. For now, though, he would carry the burden alone. And beyond the horizon, the giant continued to wake. The telegram arrived at dawn, carried by a courier whose face betrayed more than fatigue. It carried uncertainty. The ship was anchored near Truk Lagoon, the heart of Japan's forward stronghold, and the waters shimmered with a deceptive calm. As the sun rose behind him, the islands cast long shadows over the anchored carriers, Kaga's sister ships, the proud hulls of Shokaku and Zuikaku, and the smaller escort vessels arrayed like guardians of a dream that was already beginning to fray. Yamamoto accepted the telegram without ceremony. He dismissed the courier with a nod and retreated to his quarters. The moment the door shut behind him, silence reclaimed the room heavy, pensive, expectant. He broke the seal and unfolded the message. Intelligence confirms acceleration of American rearmament. New shipyard facilities nearing completion. Aircraft production, estimated to exceed original projections. Recommendation: initiate decisive action before U.S. industrial output peaks. He closed his eyes. Exactly as he had predicted. But it was the last line that unsettled him. Initiate decisive action. It was the same phrase that had propelled Japan into the waters of Hawaii, the same phrase that drove Tokyo's belief that boldness could outpace American industry. They believed that speed could substitute for strength, that momentum could outrun inevitability. He folded the message slowly, as though the act of doing so could somehow buy time. But time had become the rarest commodity in the Pacific. Outside his cabin, voices rose and fell, officers preparing for another day at sea. There was confidence in their tone assurance built from early victories and a belief in Japanese superiority. Yamamoto envied them their certainty. They saw a map dotted with conquered territories, a chain of islands captured with remarkable precision, a defensive perimeter that stretched across half the Pacific. They believed that perimeter unbreakable. Yamamoto knew better. Perimeters were illusions if the enemy possessed the means to break them, and the United States was forging those means at an unprecedented pace. He stepped outside and walked the narrow corridor to the deck. The breeze hit him instantly, cool and salt-heavy, carrying the faint roar of engines warming up. Sailors saluted as he passed, their movements crisp, their respect palpable. They believed in him not only as their admiral, but as the architect of Japan's naval vision. Their trust was a weight heavier than any medal. He returned their salutes with a nod and approached the railing. Below, the water was a mirror, flawless and blue, the sort of blue that made the Pacific seem endless, eternal. But Yamamoto had spent too many years studying the nature of conflict to be deceived by beauty. War, like the ocean, hid its treachery beneath a peaceful surface. Footsteps approached hesitantly behind him. "Admiral," came a familiar voice. It was Vice Admiral Ugaki, his chief of staff and closest confidant. Unlike many officers, Ugaki shared Yamamoto's capacity for foresight and his burden of doubt. "Another message from Tokyo?" Ugaki asked, falling into step beside him. Yamamoto handed him the folded telegram. Ugaki read it quickly, his brow furrowing. "They want to force a decisive battle," he murmured. "They believe they must." Yamamoto replied, "Before America becomes something they can no longer face." Ugaki folded the message again, more forcefully this time. "We should press the advantage while we have it. Strike again, once, twice, until their fleet cannot recover." Yamamoto turned to him, not in anger but in sorrow. "Tell me, Ugaki, how many times must we strike before they cannot recover? Twice? 5 times? 10? Can we sink their factories? Silence their forges? Tear apart their population? We face not an army or a fleet, we face a nation built for endurance." Ugaki's jaw tightened. "Then what do you propose?" "Strategy does not change the nature of the enemy. We may win battles, but we cannot win the war by outbuilding the United States." Ugaki said nothing for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Yet High Command expects you to deliver victory," he finally said. Yamamoto smiled with a bitterness he rarely allowed himself to show. "High Command expects reality to bend to their wishes. The Pacific does not bend." The hum of engines intensified as aircraft began to roll across the carrier decks, warming for their training flights. Yamamoto and Ugaki watched in silence as the first Zero launched into the air, rising like a white-winged spear into the sky. Its grace was undeniable, its beauty nearly unmatched. Yamamoto knew the Zero was a masterpiece, light, agile, an aerial predator, but he also knew its skin was thin, its design sacrificed armor for maneuverability, a calculated risk, one that worked when numbers were equal, but numbers would not remain equal for long. More aircraft followed, lifting into the air one by one. The sound was a symphony to most ears, a testament to Japan's rising power. But to Yamamoto, it was an echo of an American chorus growing louder, deeper, stronger with every passing day. Ugaki studied him for a moment, then asked quietly, "Do you believe we still have a chance?" Yamamoto remained silent for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was low but unwavering. "Everyone has a chance, even the smallest nation, but chance is not victory. And the American chance grows larger with each sunrise." Ugaki opened his mouth to reply, but a sharp whistle from the officer of the deck drew their attention. A communications runner sprinted toward them. "Admiral, priority signal from Rabaul headquarters." Yamamoto nodded. "Bring it to my cabin." The runner saluted and darted off. Yamamoto exchanged a look with Ugaki before heading inside. The moment he stepped through the door, he sensed the shift the air felt heavier, as though the message waiting for him carried more than routine intelligence. The runner arrived moments later, breathless. "Urgent report, sir. American carrier groups sighted moving toward the Coral Sea region." Yamamoto took the paper. His eyes moved swiftly over the text. "Enemy naval forces identified. Carrier activity suspected. Course indicates possible threat to our Port Moresby operation. He handed the message to Ugaki. So it begins. Ugaki frowned. They're reacting faster than anticipated. Faster, Yamamoto repeated, and with more coordination than our analysts believed possible. He paced the length of the cabin once, his mind calculating possibilities with the precision of an abacus. The Coral Sea was not merely an expanse of water, it was a crossroads of strategy. If America protected Port Moresby, Japan's southern push would be halted. If Japan succeeded, it would threaten Australia and extend the perimeter further. The first major confrontation between carrier forces was approaching, and Yamamoto knew that how they fought this battle would shape everything that followed. We must prepare, Yamamoto said quietly. For the battle? Ugaki asked. For the consequences, Yamamoto replied. Ugaki straightened. Should I draft orders for reinforcement of the carrier groups? But more importantly, prepare for the possibility that the Americans have deciphered our intentions. He met Ugaki's eyes. I do not believe in coincidences. Ugaki nodded, understanding. The possibility that American intelligence had cracked elements of Japan's communications was not unthinkable, merely unspoken. But Yamamoto had long suspected that the enemy was adapting faster than Tokyo realized. We must move carefully, Yamamoto said, and we must not underestimate their ability to anticipate. Ugaki bowed and left to begin preparations. Alone again, Yamamoto sat at his desk. For the first time, the cabin felt too quiet, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. He stared at the map spread across his desk, lines of ink stretching across oceans, islands marked like stepping stones in an unfathomable journey. He traced a finger along the path toward Midway, another operation Tokyo was already discussing. High Command saw Midway as the decisive battle, the lure that would draw the American fleet into a trap. But Yamamoto felt a growing unease whenever the operation surfaced in conversation. It depended on assumptions about American behavior, American intelligence, American readiness, assumptions about an enemy who had already defied expectations. He leaned back and closed his eyes. The thrum of the ship's engines vibrated through the floor, a reminder of the movement of forces larger than any one man. He thought again of the phrase he had written, the sleeping giant, the industrial might, the inevitability of awakening. He imagined the assembly lines now longer, faster, louder. He imagined workers lined shoulder to shoulder, sweat on their brows, determination in their bones. He imagined Liberty ships being welded together at impossible speeds, bombers rolling out, of massive doors, fighters lined like rows of steel wings waiting to soar. He imagined, too, the anger, the grief, the sense of violated pride that had washed over the United States after Pearl Harbor. Americans were emotional, yes, but they were also methodical. They did not forget, and they did not forgive. A knock came at the door. Yamamoto opened his eyes. Enter. It was Ugaki again, his expression tense. Admiral, more intelligence from the coast. American radio traffic has increased sharply near Hawaii. They may be preparing a major offensive. Yamamoto nodded slowly. Good. Let them prepare. He stood. We will prepare as well. But Ugaki noticed something in his eyes. A shadow. A knowledge. A growing certainty that the war was shifting in ways others could not yet see. Is something wrong? Ugaki asked. Yamamoto shook his head. Not wrong. Simply inevitable. Ugaki frowned slightly, but before he could speak, another officer appeared at the doorway. Admiral, the fleet awaits your command. Yamamoto stepped past them, straightening his uniform as he walked. The hallway was alive with movement sailors rushing to stations, officers conferring over maps, engineers adjusting equipment. The ship crackled with energy, like a coiled spring ready to be released. Yamamoto emerged onto the deck once more. Planes roared overhead. Crews prepared for the next stage of war. The sun climbed higher, burning away the remnants of dawn. He felt the wind on his face, warm and insistent. The horizon stretched wide and merciless before him. He raised his chin. "Signal the fleet," he said. We moved to meet them. And somewhere far beyond the edge of sight, the American giant, now fully awake, prepared to meet him. The sea was deceptively calm when the first hints of the oncoming storm reached Yamamoto. It began not with the sight of aircraft or the shadow of ships on the horizon, but with a fragment of radio intercept, American communications pulsing like distant thunder. The signals were faint, but their meaning loomed enormous. He stood on the deck of Yamato, the flagship, his floating citadel of steel and purpose. The world's most powerful battleship cut through the Pacific like a drifting mountain. Her guns, immense and silent, pointed toward nothing and everything. The crew moved across the deck with practiced discipline, but beneath their measured steps, there was an undercurrent of tension they could not hide. They felt something shifting. They could not name it, but Yamamoto could. The Americans were coming. He had no illusions left, no comforting narratives, no hopeful illusions spun by high command. The Coral Sea engagement, though not the crushing victory Japan had hoped for, had revealed something far more significant. The Americans were learning. They had moved with confidence, chosen their targets well, fought with grit and surprising coordination. Their carriers had survived, their air crews had, returned, and their losses, while real, had not slowed them. What Japan had achieved with a decade of preparation and a culture of martial discipline, America was achieving in months. It was unnatural, unstoppable, like watching a stone rolled downhill transform into a boulder, gaining speed with each passing moment. A young officer approached and saluted. "Admiral, updated reconnaissance from Tulagi. American activity increasing. We believe they're preparing larger carrier operations." Yamamoto dismissed him with a nod. The officer hesitated, as though wanting to say more, but turned away after a moment. As he watched the young man retreat across the deck, Yamamoto felt a pang of something he rarely allowed himself to feel: sympathy. These young officers had been raised on the idea of Japanese invincibility, taught that spirit could overcome steel, that courage could compensate for weakness in material. They had been told the Americans were soft, decadent, unfocused, but courage did not bend steel, and spirit did not build aircraft carriers. The ocean wind shifted, blowing in from the east. He inhaled deeply. Somewhere far across the water, behind thousands of miles of horizon, was the largest industrial engine in the world, awake now, fully awake, and marching toward him. Ugaki joined him on the deck, carrying a folder tucked under one arm. His expression was taut, but not from fear. It was the expression of a man who had come to understand the truth slowly, painfully, and without flinching. "Reports from Yokosuka," Ugaki said. "American production exceeded last month's estimates. New carriers are ahead of schedule." Yamamoto accepted the folder and flipped through the documents. Numbers, charts, projections. They told the story more plainly than any battlefield map. America was not simply rebuilding what had been lost at Pearl Harbor. It was multiplying. He closed the folder. "How long," he asked quietly, "before they outnumber us?" Ugaki exhaled. 6 months, perhaps. A year at most. A year. A single rotation of seasons. Japan had gambled on a war that needed to be won in 6 months. Instead, it was entering the second year of a marathon. More reports followed. Movement toward Midway. American carriers, maneuvering with uncanny foresight, ultra-fast coordination between fleets, a pattern too precise to be coincidence. "Do you believe," Ugaki asked one evening as they studied the signals, "that they have broken our codes?" Yamamoto didn't answer immediately. His fingers traced the lines of intercepted American traffic on the table, calculating, comparing, weighing. Finally, he spoke. "I believe the Americans are proving exactly what I warned Tokyo. They are resourceful, they learn quickly, and they do not underestimate us as we underestimated them." Ugaki nodded grimly. "Then Midway." Yamamoto finished the sentence quietly. "Midway may not be the trap we think it is. It may be the trap we walk into." But there was no turning back. Tokyo saw Midway as essential both symbolically and strategically. The Americans had to be drawn into battle, broken, humiliated, overwhelmed before their rising power could tilt the war irreversibly. Yamamoto knew this was a gamble on a scale unmatched in naval history. He also knew it was their last one. The days that followed were a blur of planning and tension, ships refueling, crews training, carrier decks humming with aircraft movements. Across the fleet, officers spoke with a mix of confidence and bravado. Some believed Midway would be another Pearl Harbor, swift, decisive, devastating. Others clung to optimism out of necessity, their own doubts pushed aside so they could do their duty. The night before the fleet began its advance, Yamamoto stood alone near the bow of Yamato. The moon cast a pale ribbon of light across the water, shimmering like a path leading into fate. The Pacific stretched endlessly ahead, but to Yamamoto, it felt smaller than ever, closing in around him, tightening like the grip of a hand. He thought of home, of the quiet streets of Nagaoka where he had grown up. He thought of the days before war had swallowed the world, when he had been a young officer with dreams of modernization and a belief that conflict could be avoided through diplomacy. He thought of the United States, the jazz halls of Chicago, the brilliance of Harvard's libraries, the vigor of American youth. He thought of everything that had led to this moment. He whispered into the wind, "Forgive me." Perhaps he was speaking to Japan, perhaps to America, perhaps to history. Dawn broke like fire across the sky as the fleet began its long advance toward Midway. Planes warmed on the carrier decks, their silver skins flashing in the sunlight. Battleships steamed forward, their wakes cutting through the water like scars. Destroyers weaved patterns along the formation, their crews scanning the horizon with binoculars raised. On the bridge of Yamato, the atmosphere shifted. Officers spoke in clipped tones, telegraphs clattered, signal flags rose and fell. The fleet was alive now, every ship a part of a vast organism moving toward destiny. Yamamoto remained at the center of the storm, steady, composed, unreadable. By midday, the first signs of American reconnaissance appeared, fleeting shadows across the sky, small aircraft barely visible against the blue. They were not a surprise. The Americans would defend Midway fiercely. Tokyo expected this. What Tokyo did not expect, what Yamamoto feared, was how fiercely. Hours later, intelligence arrived, confirming that American carriers were indeed at sea. "They're moving to intercept," Ugaki said. "Of course they are," Yamamoto replied. The tension spread through the fleet like electricity. Officers debated rapidly. Should they press the attack? Should they slow their advance? Should they adjust formation? Yamamoto gave the order, continue, maintain, operational plan. If Midway was a trap, it was too late to avoid it. The only option left was to execute with absolute precision. Night fell again over the Pacific, but sleep was a stranger. The ship thrummed with preparations, mechanics checking every aircraft component, gunners polishing barrels, navigators plotting every coordinate. Yamamoto sat at his desk, reviewing every element of the operation again and again, searching for weaknesses, for opportunities, for errors too subtle to notice but too dangerous to ignore. But he kept returning to the same conclusion. This battle would not be decided by plans alone. The next morning erupted with tension. The carriers Kaga, Akagi, Soru, and Hiru launched wave after wave of aircraft toward Midway. Smoke rose from the island as bombs struck. Reports flowed in American defenses damaged, airfields hit, fires burning. Tokyo's optimism surged. But Yamamoto felt an unease deep in his bones. The Americans were not breaking, they were responding. Adaptively, rapidly, strategically. And then, the moment everything shifted. A frantic burst of radio calls, confusion on the carriers, commands overlapping, pilots shouting, new contacts appearing on radar, contacts moving fast, American dive bombers. Yamamoto stood absolutely still as the first distant rumble echoed across the water. Then another, and another. The air outside the ship shuddered with shockwaves. Smoke rose on the horizon. Not from Midway, from Japan's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soru. Three of the most powerful carriers in the world engulfed in flames within minutes. The bridge of Yamato fell into stunned silence. Ugaki's voice trembled. How did they find them so quickly? Yamamoto's answer was quiet, hollow. Because they are not the enemy we once believed they were. The distant carriers burned like dying suns. Aircraft tried to launch or land amid chaos, some spiraling into the sea, others consumed by flames before reaching the deck. Explosions punctuated the air again and again, each one a hammer blow against the Japanese fleet and against Yamamoto's spirit. For hours, chaos reigned. Smoke clouded the horizon. Debris drifted across the waves. Survivors leapt into the water, their shouts carried faintly by the wind. Ugaki stood beside him, pale, devastated. "Admiral, what are your orders?" Yamamoto closed his eyes. The weight of every decision he had ever made pressed against him all at once. The dream of a decisive Japanese victory gone. The illusion of American weakness shattered. The sleeping giant was not only awake, it was walking now, fast, unstoppable. "Order withdrawal," Yamamoto said at last. Ugaki stared at him. "Withdrawal?" "Yes." His voice was steel now, steady, unbreakable. "The battle is lost." The words struck like a blade. Officers rushed to relay commands. Signal flags changed. Telegraphs clattered. The fleet began to shift, turning away from Midway, away from victory, away from the future Japan had imagined for itself. Yamamoto remained still on the bridge, watching as his carriers continued to burn, their steel bones collapsing into the sea. Each one was a wound that pierced not only the fleet but the nation's dream. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Only the truth remained. America had awakened, and the world would never be the same. The train slid into Washington like a steel serpent fighting exhaustion, its wheels screeching under the strain of war schedules and sleepless nights. Captain Daniel Reeves stepped down onto the platform, still carrying the dust of Midway's shattered decks in the creases of his uniform. The capital hit him like another world, marbled buildings instead of burning metal, polished shoes instead of oil-soaked boots, and whispers of policy replacing the roar of exploding boilers. He felt displaced, as if he'd walked off the edge of one reality and into a theatre production of another. A messenger led him through corridors buzzing with analysts and clerks who moved as if by invisible choreography. Their hands carried reports, their eyes carried fear. War posters lined the walls, an eagle gripping lightning, a worker holding a wrench like a weapon, slogans urging unity and sacrifice. Reeves felt a strange pressure behind his ribs. These posters reminded him that the nation believed in the Navy as its shield. None of them knew how close that shield had come to shattering. He was ushered into a quiet room, lined with shelves and a single long table. 3 men already sat waiting intelligence, naval operations, and a civilian strategist whose thick glasses reflected the overhead lamps. They studied Reeves as though he were a living map of the Pacific. "Captain Reeves," the senior officer said, "we've reviewed your logs. Now we need what can't be captured in writing." Reeves swallowed. Midway was not a battle, he said slowly. It was an unravelling. Reeves described the attack with careful detail, the way Akagi burned like a falling star, the split-second decisions, the screams swallowed by the sea, the strange sorrow that clung to every victory. He told them about the Japanese resolve, the unspoken weight in every intercepted message, the near-superhuman discipline of their pilots. But he hesitated at one core truth: the human cost behind the enemy's courage. Still, the civilian strategist pressed him. "Captain, our analysts believe the Japanese command is beginning to fear its own early success. Does your experience support this?" Reeves closed his eyes, remembering that quiet moment on the USS Yorktown, before it sank for good when he'd overheard captured Japanese sailors whisper among themselves. He had not understood the words, only the tone, reverence, mixed with dread. "I believe," Reeves said finally, opening his eyes again, "that they know they've awakened something larger than they expected. and they're terrified of how it will end." The men exchanged glances, scribbled notes. Reeves was dismissed with polite gratitude and a promise that his testimony would be integrated into strategic projections. As he stepped back into the hallway, he realized that the room behind him, with its charts and maps and clean lines, was the opposite of war. War was smoke and chaos and instinct. War was survival, but decisions were made here, not there. And the men in that room had never watched a ship die. Across the world, in a Tokyo dimmed by ration lamps, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood over a long table cluttered with dispatches. The paper smelled faintly of ink and a growing, bitter fear. Outside, wind passed between wooden houses like a ghost searching for warmth. The Admiral's face was turned slightly toward the window, though his eyes were unfocused, fixed instead on the echo of the past. Pearl Harbor had been meant to shock America into hesitation. Instead, it had done the opposite. Reports lay before him Midway's losses, industrial assessments from spies, the projected American shipbuilding timeline. His pilots had fought like spirits pulled from legend, but legends could not fight the foundries of a nation waking to fury. He lifted one sheet, tracing the figures. Thousands of aircraft expected in the coming months, hundreds of destroyers, dozens of carriers, a storm forged in steel. A junior officer knocked and entered, bowing deeply. "Admiral, shall I prepare your speech for the War Cabinet meeting tomorrow?" Speech. The word tasted heavy. "Leave the papers," Yamamoto said softly. "I will prepare my own." The officer bowed again and retreated. Yamamoto sat, pen poised above a blank sheet. The candle beside him flickered, its flame bending as though straining to read the future. He began writing slowly, his script elegant despite the fatigue etched into his bones. "We have achieved many tactical victories. Yet we stand on the threshold of a great strategic failure." He paused, listening to the faint sounds of Tokyo outside, the soft rumble of bicycles, the distant squeal of a train, the cough of a weary worker returning home. These were the people who would suffer the weight of decisions made by men like him. The Americans possess not only wealth, but an industrial spirit that multiplies with adversity. If our nation does not recognize this truth, we will face consequences beyond imagination. He set the pen down and exhaled. Somewhere deep within him lived a man who loved poetry, who believed in beauty and restraint. That man had been buried beneath duty. But sometimes, in the quiet hours between night and dawn, bits of him resurfaced in lines of writing he could never say aloud. Tokyo's lights dimmed again as the city entered its energy-saving cycle. In the darkness, Yamamoto whispered words he would never record. "We have awakened their sleeping giant, and its breath alone may extinguish us." Back in Washington, Reeves exited the War Department building into a chill breeze that carried the distant scent of burning coal. He walked without direction, passing the Lincoln Memorial's reflecting pool, where the water held the rippled image of the monument's white pillars like a memory refusing to blur. Lights glowed on the water's surface, soft and haloed. War felt impossibly far from this peaceful place. He sat on a bench, hands clasped between his knees, and let himself breathe. The Capitol dome rose in the distance like a guardian overseeing a nation of millions, preparing for sacrifices they did not yet fully understand. A woman pushing a stroller passed by. A group of soldiers laughed somewhere behind him. Life moved on, unstoppably. A voice broke his solitude. "You look like a man carrying an ocean." Reeves turned to see an older man in civilian clothes, wearing a suit slightly too small for his frame. His hair was grey at the temples, his eyes sharp with a kind of gentle wisdom. Reeves didn't recognize him, but something about the man radiated calm authority. "I'm just trying to make sense of it," Reeves replied. "War never makes sense," the man said, sitting beside him. "But people try to give it meaning. That's where they get lost." Reeves studied him carefully. "Were you in the service?" "Long ago. Before you were born." The man smiled faintly. "Let me ask you something, Captain. What did you learn out there beyond the strategies and the orders?" Reeves hesitated. Then he answered honestly. That the enemy is not a monster. They're men, skilled, committed, sometimes frightened, and every victory feels like a funeral. The older man nodded, his expression softening. Then you've learned the most important truth. War is fought by nations, but suffered by individuals. A silence stretched, carried by the soft splash of water against the reflecting pool's edge. The man rose. One day, he said, this war will end, and when it does, men like you will have to help rebuild what was lost, the human part of it. Reeves wanted to ask who he was, how he understood so much. But the man was already walking away, his silhouette merging with the deepening dark. Meanwhile, aboard a small reconnaissance ship gliding through the night fog of the Central Pacific, the Japanese officer Arata Takahashi stood at the bow, gripping the railing with white-knuckled intensity. He had been one of the few survivors pulled from the seas near Midway. His burns were healing, but his mind remained scorched. He watched the ocean stretch endlessly before him, a vast black expanse broken only by faint moonlight. The rhythmic churn of the ship's engines comforted him, steady, reliable, indifferent to the chaos of men. He closed his eyes and whispered the names of pilots he'd trained with, flown with, laughed with. Their voices echoed in memory like ghosts carried by the wind. One day earlier, he had been summoned to a private meeting with a senior commander. The commander's question still haunted him. Lieutenant Takahashi, do you still believe our cause is winnable? He had answered instinctively, with loyalty. But deep inside, doubt had taken root. The Americans were not merely rebuilding, they were accelerating, growing stronger by the day, fueled by a unity Japan could not match. A sudden swell rocked the ship, pulling Takahashi from his thoughts. He glanced upward as clouds parted briefly, revealing a sky scattered with stars. For a moment, he imagined he could see the entire Pacific spread across that sky, battles past and battles yet to come, each point of light a soul searching for home. He whispered, if only both sides could see the cost written in the stars. But the sea answered with silence. Back in Washington, Reeves returned to his temporary quarters and sat at the small desk near the window. The city lights blinked below like a constellation rearranging itself. A blank sheet of paper lay before him. He knew what he needed to write, not a report, not a statement, but something human. He began writing to the families of the men lost at Midway. He wrote slowly, deliberately, trying to honor each life, each sacrifice, each dream cut short. His words carried the weight of the ocean he still felt inside him. For hours, he wrote. Outside, dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with soft hues of gold and grey. Another day of war, another day closer to an ending no one could fully imagine. Reeves paused, pen hovering. He thought of the older man by the reflecting pool, the Japanese survivors at Midway, the burning carriers, Yamamoto writing in the dim light of his Tokyo office, and he realized the truth that tied them all together. This war was not merely a clash of armies, it was a collision of destinies. And no one, not even the admirals or the strategists, knew how the final chapter would truly unfold. He dipped his pen again. Then he kept writing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.